application delegate reference, which just means, again, my app delegate implements that thing. So what I actually want to go to, let's do that trick from earlier, UI window. And there, sure enough, let's make sure we get the iOS version and not the macOS version. So let's add iOS there. UI window class reference. And now if I scroll down, tasks, which again are methods, key window. We haven't seen that before, but it sounds like the buzzword we saw earlier. And aha, there is the formal documentation that says a UI window, which is what my window property points to, has a property called root view controller. And if I read the documentation, the root view controller provides the content view of the window, assigning a view controller to this property, installs the view controller's view as the content view, This is how you specify who the brains are behind your application. And it's going to be specifically an instance of my view controller class. So the only 2 lines here then that are new are this. The only files that are new are the 3 up there. So there's one file we haven't looked at yet, which is viewcontroller.m. So the implementation of this class. So looks like, fortunately, just some template code. And in fact, I can delete all of this. So let's see what's in here of interest, potentially. I've got a @interface sign at the top, view controller, open parens, and then end. This feels weird, because where do I usually see @interface? So in the header file. But I already saw this in the header file. Just to be clear, if we go back to viewcontroller.h, I already have @interface view controller. So what is this doing here? What's that? Yeah, it's sort of a private interface. It's using what appears to be a, what's the buzzword here? A feature of the language known as a category. Yet, turns out, and this was something added somewhat recently, you can have nameless categories with no name, open paren, close paren. So this is a category, which just means here, hey Xcode, here comes some more methods that are associated with the view controller class. Now it turns out this is just boilerplate code that Apple's provided a starting point. There are no such methods, but if I wanted to have private methods that I don't inform the world about via my header file, where do I put them? Where that blank line is, right there. But functionally, this isn't doing anything for me. It's kind of overwhelming me, so I'm just going to get rid of it with no effect. @implementation is what I did expect to see in this file. And now there's 2 methods that we did not see before. And they're not arbitrary. Turns out that view did load and did receive memory warning are methods defined by Apple in what class? They're not in my class, because, right, if I go to my header file, I made no commitment to implementing those 2. So where do view did load and did receive memory warning come from? Yeah? Yeah, it must come from some parent or ancestor class. And I'm going to guess it's from UI view controller. And if we actually looked at the documentation there, maybe followed some links, hopefully we would indeed see the definitions, or the declarations of those methods in the documentation. Now, what do? Thankfully, there is an upside to the verboseness of all these method names. View did load, that method is invoked when the view did load. Now, what's the view? Just to recap. What is the view with respect to an application? The interface. So when some stuff came up on the screen, what method gets called? That one. Why might that be of interest? Well, once the stuff has been painted on the screen, the text fields and the sliders and whatnot, maybe you want to start updating the values. Maybe you want to start bouncing a ball around once the UI has been generated for your game. Whatever you might want to do could happen at that juncture. And so Apple's comment here says, do any additional setup after loading the view, typically from a nib. So this just means especially if your interface came from a serialized XML file. So just a nib file that you created with the drag and drop interface we saw briefly earlier. You can, from this method, do more stuff once that UI has been reconstructed into your program. Now, super, for those unfamiliar or less familiar, what's that line of code doing above the comment? Yeah? Exactly. That line of code is passing the viewDidLoad message to the super class, which is the parent object of this particular class. Now this too is a convention, and if you read the documentation, Apple will say if you implement viewDidLoad, you had better remember to call our version of this method in case there's some important stuff that happens in this class hierarchy after which you can do your thing. So I'm fine with deleting the whole method, because if I delete it, it will still exist where? In the parent class. What I should not do is ever get into this habit, which means my object might not be properly loaded if I have not called the parent class's implementations of the same method. So again, you know that really by convention and from reading the documentation carefully. But viewDidLoad, don't need it. Did receive memory warning. I'm not going to need this one either, so I'll hit delete. But you can probably guess what this means. If your iPhone has a limited amount of memory, which it does, and you start loading lots and lots of apps, and you've gotten a lot of mail, loaded some big web pages in Safari, and your phone is running short on RAM, this message might get sent to your game saying, hey, you better calm down and give up some RAM, especially if you've been a little sloppy with your coding and have been allocating and allocating and allocating objects that you just don't need. This is your application's chance to give memory back, because if you don't cooperate and if you don't try to respond to this programmatically, what do you think Apple does to your program while running on the user's phone? They just kill it. After some number of seconds, if your application has not freed up some megabytes per Apple's request, they kill it in the interest of a good user experience. But if you've ever wondered why applications might just disappear from the screen, could just be that it's really crappy code and they had some memory error and just the thing crashed and Apple just terminated it for that reason. Or it just got memory hungry, didn't adhere to this admonishment, and so iOS killed it for that reason as well. Au contraire. So it is very easy to start allocating objects, maybe keeping them in around an array that you actually don't really need, or even in the context of the upcoming project, which we'll talk about in lab on Wednesday, you'll have an opportunity to load tens of thousands of English words from a dictionary file that we will provide to you. And it's very easy to keep those around in memory in the original data format, and yet you don't really ever need it again. And if you don't think about when you actually need data, or you don't actually decide, you know what, I might need it, but hell, I'll just reload it from the file system when I need it, you can start churning through more memory than you actually intend. So it's gotten easier to deal with memory management thanks to that ARC feature, automatic reference counting. We don't have to worry about freeing memory as much, but you can absolutely allocate more memory than you really, really need. Yeah? A statute of limitations in what sense?
Like, there's only so much relying on ARC where you can still run out of.
Absolutely. So ARC will free your memory when it determines that you don't need it anymore. But it is very, very easy for me to declare a pointer in a certain way and tuck it away in my app delegate and just keep it in perpetuity. And the operating system will never know if I might need it, because this reduces to something known as the halting problem. If you're familiar from a theory class, you don't necessarily know if and when certain code fragments you wrote will get called. And if those code fragments might eventually touch that object, it can't necessarily be freed. So you can very easily contrive scenarios where you consume way too much memory. And as an aside, you can simulate this. Thankfully, you don't have to just cross your fingers when developing iOS apps that you'll see this problem before you ship your program. You can go up to hardware and simulate memory warning, and you can force the simulator to send that message to your phone so you can figure out in advance just how well you're handling the situation. Let's see, another hand went up. Yes? Mm-hmm. Good question. So whenever in doubt, let me hold option. Let me go ahead and click on the method name. And here we have returns a newly initialized view controller with the nib file in the specified bundle. So if I keep reading here, if you specify nil for, let's see, where's the nib? So if we read long enough, we'll get to the discussion of the bundle. The bundle you can think of as a program's folder. You can have nibs in different bundles and different folders effectively, which can be helpful for things like iPad UIs versus iPhone UIs and the like. Nil in this case just means get me the default, which is right there and can be found by its name. Good question. Can have to do with localization too, if you've got an English version, a Spanish version, both of which you created with the drag and drop interface. Yes?
Can you actually call parent class?
Yes, because you could. Actually, let's see. Super good question.
Or would you have to implement a method that would then call?
You can definitely do the latter, implementing a method that does that in the parent class. I don't think you can access the grandparent class directly. You need to have some kind of preparation in advance with that parent class. Good question. All right, so wonderfully interesting maybe, but at the end of the day, we still made a pretty crappy application that just does this. But still, there's some kind of communication now between that nib and my code, and we saw that by way of the loading of the nib. But this is a purely unidirectional program. When I run it, all I see is text before me. There's no means of interaction. So let's start to make something more interesting, a little more from scratch, that allows me to interact with the application itself. So I'm going to go ahead and close that one, create a new project, so not a new file, a new project, single view application. And this is generally where I'm going to start now, because with single view application, as you saw, we get a view controller and the nib file and the header file, and we get some additional wiring in the code. But I could absolutely have recreated that simple little hello class program by starting with an empty application and going to the file menu and saying new file and gradually adding back all of the individual files. The headache that arises quickly if you start doing too many things from scratch is you have to reconfigure some of those lower level settings that you just get for free with some of the templates. So I would start initially with the more useful templates, and only once you get comfortable, try recreating some of these things, as we may do in lab this week, from scratch and reconstructing what someone at Apple has already done for us. So single view application. I'm going to go ahead and call this thing nib1, just my first example involving a nib that I'm going to really give some thought to. I'm going to turn off storyboards just for now to keep things consistent with that last story. Click Next, save it wherever. And now I have essentially the same exact application I had a moment ago. Sure enough, if I click on my nib on the left-hand side, I just get an empty iPhone window there. So now let's do something a little more interesting. On the right-hand side here, there's a whole bunch of Photoshop-like options, whereby you can start tinkering with the WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, interface, the drag and drop interface. And this is frankly a little overwhelming at first glance, and I don't think I've clicked on 50% of these over time, but there's a few that I occasionally use if you're actually using Interface Builder to create your UI. One of them is surely the Objects submenu down here, where I can drag and drop things like labels. I did that before. So let's start there. Let me scroll down, and let me get a text field. I want to write an application, I think, that allows me to type in my name, hit enter, or click a button on my screen, and be greeted, hello, David, or whatever name I happen to type in. So some dynamism that we just haven't had to date. So I could, of course, just do this, label, hello, David, but as we saw before, that is not really the point here. Well, let's actually have a text field that the user types in. Let's see a keyboard pop up and actually interact. So let's delete that. And again, I'm clicking and deleting just like you would in Photoshop or GIMP or whatever graphics program that you might have tried in the past. So give me a text field, and I'm going to notice a few things happen. Much like in Photoshop and other programs, you get some suggestions as to where to put it relative to where the glass is and how thick a human finger is, but you can ignore that. But I'll just do that. I'm going to now click and expand it. So here I am programming. All right, and now I have this text field, and now notice up top, there's a whole bunch of these icons. Frankly, after several years, I still don't remember what one is what. But if you hover over them, you get little tooltips. So this one here is called the Identity Inspector. We'll click on that in a moment. This one's the Attributes Inspector. This one is the Size Inspector. And this one is the Connections Inspector. So let's start with Attributes Inspector. So that's this one here. And notice I can do a few things. I can change the color of this text field, the font size. How about some placeholder text? Just like in HTML5, you have a placeholder attribute. I'm going to put name here. And now notice if I look at my GUI, I have a grayed out word name. So that's nice. It's a nice little enhancement. How about the background? If I click on the gray background, notice over here on the Attributes Inspector, I can choose a different color. So that's kind of interesting. Let's click Other, zoom out so I can see it. Choose the little crayon things, and let's change it to white. So now I have a UI more like the one I got earlier for free by just using the empty application. And now I need a button to submit. So where's that? I'm going to drag and drop the button here. That's where Apple recommends I put it. I'm going to double click on it like in Photoshop and type Go. But notice I could also be a little more anal and go over here, and I could manually type that here. I can change the style of this button. Let's see. Instead of a rounded rect button, I could do something like an info button, but that's not what I wanted. That's that little eye icon that you see in, I think, the stock application. So